We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The decision was already made before Camilla understood how far it would go. Behind closed doors, King Charles placed his signature on an order removing her from Windsor House and transferring control of the residence to Prince William. There was no grand announcement in the room, no dramatic speech, only a pen touching paper, and a silence heavy enough to change 3 royal lives at once. What followed was not merely a property decision, it was a declaration of power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stayed seated after the ink dried. He looked at the final page for several long seconds, then rested the pen across the closed file instead of passing it away. The transfer was a formal written order, changing who controlled Windsor House, meaning the right to use, manage, and direct the residence, now moved from Camilla to William. That mattered because this house represented far more than rooms. It meant privacy, access, status, and closeness to the center of royal life. Camilla received the news in a private sitting room and did not answer at first. She looked toward the aide standing near the door, then asked one question: was the decision temporary? The answer came softly: no. Her face tightened. She placed her untouched cup on the table and pushed her chair back, as though distance from the room might somehow soften what she had just heard. It did not. For her, the loss struck at security itself, because Windsor had come to symbolize a place she believed could no longer be taken away. William felt no triumph when the file reached him. The prince learned quickly that this was not being held for some distant future. The keys, household authority, and control of the residence were being transferred now, during his father's reign. Even more unsettling, Charles had personally ordered that his son's name appear on the document, rather than leaving the property under a general crown arrangement, a structure where the residence would remain controlled broadly by the monarchy instead of one individual. Charles finally closed the file and said only, "Give it to William." He did not explain himself. He did not soften the order. Yet across the palace, Camilla was already asking a more dangerous question. She did not ask why William had received the house. She asked who had persuaded the king that she should lose it. That question exposed the deeper wound. The signature explained what Charles had done, but the real story now belonged to the 3 people trapped together inside its consequences. For Charles, Camilla, and William, Windsor House represented 3 completely different things. To the king, it had become a burden tied to decisions he could no longer postpone. To Camilla, it symbolized belonging, a place inside the royal world she had spent decades fighting to secure. To William, it was something more uncomfortable, a gift he had never publicly demanded, handed to him at the precise moment his father was taking it away from someone else. Charles carried that conflict more heavily than anyone around him could see. As sovereign, the person holding the crown and therefore final authority over major royal household decisions, he believed preparing William for the future could no longer remain symbolic. The transfer gave the heir real control now, not someday. Yet as a husband, the king understood exactly what had been taken from Camilla. Windsor House had become tied to privacy, routine, and the feeling that her place inside the family had finally become secure. Camilla felt the loss differently. Speaking quietly to an aide after the decision reached her, she admitted that surrendering rooms could have been endured. Knowing William would now occupy the position she had lost made the wound feel public, even before anyone outside the palace knew. The queen consort understood that access to Windsor shaped more than where she stayed. It affected meetings, private routines, household influence, and the quiet signs of status that mattered inside royal life. William showed no excitement when the transfer papers were placed before him. He left the file unopened and asked whether his father had personally explained everything to Camilla. The prince understood the danger immediately. However the decision had been made, he could now appear to be benefiting from her humiliation. He suggested delaying the handover, giving everyone time to adjust before the change became real. Charles refused. He tapped the file once and looked directly at his son. This is not a discussion about what you want. It is about what comes next. The king made clear that the arrangement had already been settled and would not be reconsidered. William could dislike the timing, but he could not escape the responsibility being placed in his hands. Camilla soon recognized something even more unsettling. Losing Windsor House had separated her from a circle of routines she had assumed were protected, and that raised a frightening possibility. Perhaps this was not simply one residence changing hands. Perhaps Charles had begun reassessing where everyone belonged, as William moved closer to the center of royal power. William finally opened the file, but the silence between father and son remained. The decision looked sudden from the outside. Inside the family, however, one recent confrontation had pushed Charles beyond hesitation. And when that forgotten argument came back into focus, Windsor House would no longer look like the cause of the fracture. It would look like the consequence. The break did not begin with a property deed. It began during a private Windsor dinner, when one seemingly ordinary question turned into an argument nobody in the room could forget. Charles had raised the issue of future residential arrangements and expected a practical conversation. Instead, Camilla challenged why spaces associated with the reigning household should already be discussed in terms of William's future authority. By the time the exchange ended, Charles was no longer debating rooms. He was confronting loyalty, succession, and control. Charles had spent the previous weeks reviewing how royal residences should support William as his responsibilities increased. The wider succession plan, the preparation of people, duties, and resources for the future reign, was becoming more concrete, and Windsor House had moved to the center of it. The king believed the heir needed real authority before eventually taking the crown. Camilla saw the same plan very differently. To her, long-established use of the residence represented continuity, trust, and proof that her place beside the monarch would not disappear simply because the future was approaching. Camilla finally challenged him over dinner. When Charles said he wanted William given permanent authority over Windsor House, she answered, "Preparing for the future should not require erasing the present." The words changed the room. She had expected resistance, perhaps even anger, but the silence that followed felt worse. The queen consort understood immediately that this was no longer an argument over rooms. She had questioned the timing of the future king's authority, and her husband heard something much deeper. Charles stared across the table, before laying down his fork. Camilla pressed him again, saying, "You are speaking as though he is already king." He held her gaze for several seconds. "I am speaking as though I intend him to be ready." Then the monarch pushed his chair back and left his meal unfinished. He did not offer the familiar warmth that usually ended difficult private conversations. For him, her resistance had crossed into opposition to a transition he believed the monarchy could no longer postpone. Charles acted before the night was over. He summoned an advisor and asked whether Windsor House could be reassigned immediately, rather than after a future change of reign. That single question transformed anger into action. The king was no longer considering what might happen someday. He was asking how quickly it could happen now. William knew nothing about the dinner at first. When he later learned that his future authority had triggered the confrontation, the prince understood with growing discomfort that he had become the dividing line between two people, without ever entering the argument himself. Camilla believed one direct conversation could still stop the papers from becoming permanent. She decided she would confront Charles herself. But by the time she prepared to face him, the decision had already hardened. Weeks of tension had become a signed order, and Windsor House had become the one line the king refused to move. Camilla entered the room, knowing Windsor House had already been taken from her. What she did not know was whether Charles still believed the decision could be separated from their marriage. With no aides beside them and no officials to absorb the anger, she demanded to know why he had chosen a transfer so personal, so visible, and so final. Charles did not raise his voice. That made the answer worse. He told her the decision was about the monarchy surviving beyond them. Camilla refused to let him hide behind duty. She already knew William's authority over the residence was immediate, which meant the signed order was not a draft waiting for approval. It was settled. Charles tried to draw a line between his role as husband and his constitutional responsibility, meaning his duty to protect the stability and future functioning of the monarchy. To her, that distinction felt impossible. The same man speaking about institutional necessity was also the man taking away a place she had believed was secure. Camilla leaned forward and asked the question that had been building since the transfer reached her. Did Charles truly believe she was standing in William's way? The king did not accuse her directly. Instead, he said resistance to necessary succession planning had made certain arrangements unworkable. She heard the meaning beneath the careful words. Her objections had stopped being treated as personal concerns. They had become obstacles. Charles felt the next words land harder. Camilla told him Windsor House had represented more than comfort. After years of scrutiny and uncertainty, it had become proof that she finally possessed a place inside royal life that could not be casually withdrawn. The queen consort watched him look away, and for a brief second, the anger between them gave way to something more painful. He understood exactly what the loss meant. He simply was not going to reverse it. Charles then removed the last possibility of negotiation. He told her the decision had been made before she entered the room that morning. The meeting was never meant to decide the future of Windsor House. It was meant to explain a future already sealed. Camilla stood slowly. "Did William ask you to do this?" she said. Charles remained seated. "No, I did." The answer destroyed the easiest target for her anger. The prince had not demanded the residence, and he had not forced the king's hand. Responsibility belonged entirely to the man sitting before her. Camilla reached the door, but Charles stopped her with one final warning. Windsor House, he said, was only one part of a larger reordering of responsibility. She paused, then closed the door without another word. That answer removed William from the accusation, but it exposed something more consequential. Charles alone had chosen to use royal authority against resistance inside his own household, and the house was only the beginning. The transfer could look like a family dispute, but Charles had begun thinking beyond the next argument and toward the next reign. Windsor House was now a symbol of a larger calculation. Who should hold authority? Who should prepare for continuity? And which arrangements had become obstacles to that plan? Yet behind every constitutional phrase was a human decision. Charles was not moving pieces on a board. He was choosing whose security would be protected and whose would be sacrificed. Charles believed William could no longer prepare for the future through titles and appearances alone. The prince needed real authority, established routines, and a household structure he could learn to control before eventually becoming sovereign. Residential control meant more than occupying rooms. It included staffing, hosting rights, access decisions, private meetings, and responsibility for how the household operated. Windsor House therefore gave the future king something practical, a place where responsibility could begin before the crown itself passed to him. Charles understood the cost. Alone with an advisor, he admitted that strengthening his son meant taking something meaningful from Camilla. The king did not pretend otherwise. He knew the timing would hurt her, and he knew the transfer could be interpreted as punishment. Yet delaying it, he argued, would only leave the same conflict waiting for a more dangerous moment. Better to settle authority now than allow uncertainty to explode later when the stakes were even higher. William remained uneasy. He told his father he did not want Windsor House to become a public symbol of victory over Camilla, as though one person had risen because another had been pushed aside. The prince feared the transfer would turn succession into a family contest. Charles listened, but his answer was firm. Appearances mattered, he said, but they could not decide every action. The future could not be organized around avoiding discomfort. Charles then reviewed a proposed compromise that would have allowed Camilla to retain shared control. He read the paragraph once, drew a line straight through it, and set the pen down. No divided authority. William must know where responsibility begins and ends. The king believed two competing centers of control would simply recreate the tension he had already chosen to end. William now understood the full weight of what he had accepted. The handover gave him more than residence. It gave him household planning authority, meaning staff connected to Windsor House would increasingly take direction from his office rather than Camilla's. That made the decision real in ways no headline could capture. Charles had drawn the boundary clearly, but paper was the easy part. Once schedules changed, instructions shifted, and keys physically moved from one hand to another, Camilla would have to face the new order every day. The principle had been settled. The fallout was about to become personal. The true shock arrived not when the document was signed, but when ordinary routines began obeying it. Names changed on household instructions. Access schedules were revised. Staff who had once turned automatically toward Camilla now waited for William's office to confirm decisions. Nothing about the process needed shouting to feel brutal. With every practical adjustment, the transfer became harder to dismiss as palace symbolism. Windsor House was no longer hers to command, and everyone around her knew it. Camilla felt the change almost immediately. Household staff received revised instructions naming William as the principal authority connected to the residence, meaning his office now had the final say over its daily management and access. She was offered alternative private accommodation and continued use of other royal spaces, but those concessions could not replace what had been lost. Windsor House had carried status, routine, and influence. Another set of rooms could provide comfort, but it could not restore control. Camilla watched an aide reach into her daily papers and remove the Windsor House briefing folder. For a moment, she stopped the movement. "Leave it for this morning," she said quietly. The Queen Consort stared at the folder, then changed her mind and waved it away. That small gesture hurt more than any formal announcement. What had once arrived automatically with her papers now belonged somewhere else. William noticed the discomfort spreading around him. The prince told staff there would be no ceremony, no staged arrival, and no symbolic celebration of the transfer. He understood that accepting responsibility was one thing, appearing to enjoy Camilla's loss was another. But Charles had already insisted on one unmistakable act. The private access keys had to pass directly to his son, leaving no confusion about who now held authority. William looked at the keys when a staff member placed them before him. He did not touch them at first. Several seconds passed before he finally closed his hand around them. "There will be no celebration of this," he said. The future king accepted the authority, but the weight of the moment was obvious. Camilla soon learned that William had ordered no immediate changes to her former rooms. The decision should have reassured her. Instead, it unsettled her. The prince was protecting her dignity while still accepting everything Charles had given him. There was no cruelty to fight against, no easy enemy to blame. The new reality simply stood there. William finally understood that silence could become its own form of damage. If he accepted Windsor House without speaking directly to Camilla, the transfer could define their relationship forever. So he made one request: a private meeting with her, without Charles, without advisors, and without anyone else to carry the words for them. He could not undo the handover. But before resentment hardened into something permanent, he intended to face her himself. For the first time since the transfer, William and Camilla sat opposite each other without Charles, officials, advisors, or paperwork in the room. There was no constitutional language left to hide behind. She had lost the house. He now held its keys. Both knew a careless sentence could turn discomfort into permanent hostility. Yet William began with the one thing Camilla had not expected him to say. He had never asked his father for Windsor House, and he had never wanted her humiliation to become the price of his future. William had requested the meeting because he wanted one thing made clear. The transfer had been Charles's decision, not a demand from the heir. The prince knew that accepting Windsor House still connected him to the outcome, but he did not want that connection to become a permanent barrier between them. Camilla entered guarded. To her, intent mattered less than consequence. He might not have asked for the residence, but he had still accepted the authority that came with it. William admitted he had considered refusing. He knew doing so would have publicly challenged his father and risked turning a private family wound into a crisis of royal authority. Camilla listened, then answered with painful simplicity. Refusing might have created trouble for him, but accepting still left her carrying the loss. The queen consort was not accusing him of cruelty. She was forcing him to understand that restraint did not erase consequence. Camilla finally explained where the deepest anger lived. Windsor House had become a symbol of security after years spent fighting for acceptance inside royal life. Discovering how quickly that security could be reassigned hurt more than losing the rooms themselves. William understood the distinction. The building was only the surface. What she feared losing was permanence. William then made a promise. Nothing connected to Camilla's private belongings or personal memories would be moved without her approval. He would not allow the transition to become an erasure disguised as administration. The prince could not return the authority Charles had handed him, but he could decide how that authority was used. Camilla's resistance softened. She finally acknowledged that William had not created the decision. The admission changed something between them. The conflict was no longer heir against queen consort. It was the consequence of a choice Charles had made, and both of them now had to live with. Camilla stood to leave and placed one old Windsor key on the table. William pushed it gently back toward her. "Keep that one. Not for authority, for memory." She closed her fingers around it without answering. The silence between them had changed. But beyond that private room, the transfer was already breaking into public view. What had begun as a family wound was about to become a national argument, and none of them would control what happened next. By morning, the Windsor transfer was no longer a private royal wound. It was a national spectacle. Commentators debated whether Charles had strengthened the succession or publicly diminished his wife. Cameras returned to Windsor's gates, where every arriving car became part of the story. Yet one image captured the mood more powerfully than hours of analysis. A newspaper front page showing Charles on one side, William on the other, and between them a photograph of Windsor, under the headline, "The House Changes Hands." Charles watched the coverage with growing frustration. Public debate had split almost instantly between those who saw the decision as firm succession planning and those who saw it as proof of a serious rupture with Camilla. Palace communications tried to steer the story toward continuity, meaning the careful transfer of responsibility from the present reign toward the next one. The message was simple. William was being prepared for greater duty. But outside the palace, the story had already become far more personal. Camilla saw the front page and said nothing. She folded the newspaper once, placed it face down, and refused suggestions that she answer publicly. The queen consort understood that any angry statement would keep the humiliation alive for another news cycle. Silence offered no victory, but it gave her one thing she still controlled: how much of her private hurt became public property. Charles had less patience. He listened as one discussion panel reduced the transfer to a contest between wife and son. as though his decision had created a winner and a loser. The king knew the reality was more complicated, but complexity was disappearing beneath the drama. What he considered preparation for the future was being interpreted as judgment on his marriage. Outside Windsor, the story grew louder. A crowd gathered near the public approach while television crews delivered live reports, and one commentator described the handover as the clearest sign yet that the future court is arriving before the present one has left. The phrase spread quickly because it captured exactly what unsettled people. William's future authority suddenly felt present. William refused to feed that image. The prince declined any triumphant statement and issued only a restrained acknowledgement centered on duty and responsibility. He had promised Camilla privately that her loss would never become his celebration, and he intended to keep that promise even as the public watched every move. Charles finally reached for the television remote midway through another panel and switched the screen off. The room went quiet. He placed the remote down and told an aide to arrange one meeting with William and Camilla together. Papers had settled ownership. Headlines had created judgment. But neither had decided what this moment would mean inside the family. The world had already delivered its verdict loudly. Now Charles knew the only judgment that truly mattered had to be spoken between the three people whose future he had just rearranged. The final meeting did not restore Windsor House to Camilla. Charles did not tear up the transfer, and William did not return the authority placed in his hands. What changed was something less visible, but more important. For the first time, all three stopped arguing about the residence as though it were only property. Charles admitted what the decision truly represented. He had chosen to accelerate the future of the monarchy, even knowing that doing so would wound the woman who had stood beside him. Charles made the permanence of the decision unmistakable. Windsor House would remain under William's authority, and there would be no return to the old arrangement. The king explained that succession planning meant preparing the next monarch with real duties and responsibility before the crown itself changed hands. He wanted uncertainty removed while he was still able to guide his son, because waiting until a future crisis would only make the transition harder. Charles then turned toward Camilla and spoke more personally. He regretted the pain caused by the finality of the transfer, but he did not regret making it. The distinction was painful, and she knew exactly what it meant. His apology belonged to the husband who understood her hurt. His decision belonged to the monarch who believed the future had to come first. William refused to let that future become a victory over her. The prince told both of them that he would accept Windsor House as a duty, not as proof that one side of the family had defeated another. He would carry the authority Charles had given him, but he would not use it to erase Camilla's dignity. For the first time, she accepted that his possession of the house did not have to mean personal rejection. Camilla made her own decision. She would not contest the transfer, demand restoration of control, or turn Windsor House into a permanent battlefield. The queen consort had lost something she once believed secure, but she refused to let that loss define everything that remained. Acceptance did not mean the wound had vanished. It meant she had chosen where the wound would end. Charles finally understood what he had set in motion. Succession was no longer an abstract future waiting beyond his reign. By placing the residence in William's hands, the king had surrendered part of the present so his son could begin carrying the future. Charles stood first when the meeting ended. Camilla gathered her papers, leaving the old Windsor key safely inside her handbag. William noticed, but said nothing. They walked away separately, yet the conflict was finished. Windsor House belonged to the prince now. She had lost control of it. Her husband had accepted the personal cost, and the monarchy had crossed a line it could not uncross. The future was no longer waiting outside the door. It had been handed the keys.